So Bookscape came about from my interest in libraries. So I'm going to talk about that aspect of it. And I'm starting with the data itself, okay? What we did. Literally, when you think about a milieu, we are talking about many different things. We're talking about people, we're talking about environment, we're talking about settings. What I did for this, and this is my solo project, I'm the PI, and I work with some research assistants. The goal was to understand where does the work of literary production take place and how. Because Calcutta has a distinct history of literary production, starting from the 18th century. And having worked on colonialism, British colonialism in India for a very long time, I had off and on gathered lots of different kinds of information, data, and thought it would be interesting to know how or why Calcutta emerged as such an important place for publication, education, books. Just so you know that until the early 20th century, when Jute took over book publishing was the biggest industry of Calcutta. So there's something to reckon with. So what I did was, I'm in a way putting the cart before the horse. There are distinct categories of data we started collecting. This is very much from archival sources, the Kumbing archival sources. One was libraries. And I'm giving you a sense of what it looks like when we are assembling the data in Excel sheets. So location ID I'm using, again, because I already have a word map of the city, I'm using that as a base. I'm using W20 and then L1 means library 1. So all the names of the libraries, the date of their beginning, activity, and you might ask, you should ask, where do I get this information from? Historic address and contemporary address. This is one of the problems if I want to plot, let's say, publishing houses or libraries. Addresses have changed. And if I drop a point where it was then you really have to do some very careful calibration to understand what was the address at that time. Okay. So mapping something historical in a contemporary city comes with some problems. Okay. You have to be really, really careful what the heck you're doing. But, and this are the references, the sources. One of the reason I was able to get the library work done first is because there's actually very useful directories of libraries produced in the 1940s and then 1950s and 1960s, which gives me a database. It doesn't give me a lot of all kinds of information, but it gives me something, including how many members in the library, what's the volume of books, which are extremely useful. And I have tried to look up whether there are equivalent information for other parts of India. I didn't find it. Doesn't mean they don't exist, but I didn't find them. It was done for all of Bengal, but the data for Calcutta is particularly rich. But I also have a way to compare that with what was happening in other provincial towns in Bengal. And this is undivided Bengal 19. Okay, so this is 1946 is the 1942. So, and then there are the 1963 is the last one. And after that, there are very few things written about libraries, and they're all in Bengali. And the ones that are written in English are not that actually helpful, and they don't go to the nitty-gritties. So there's very scant literature on libraries, per se, on colonial or not. So we were compiling, data, and I'll come back to this. What does it mean that there were 295 public libraries in 1942 of which 22 were neighborhood libraries, 156 were school libraries, and 21 were college libraries. Total 429 libraries. Okay, that's an extraordinary number, actually. And then there were institutions, all education institutions, excluding schools. We did not. Sorry. This is publishing. This is publishing means publishing houses. These are the publishers, and we made a distinction between publishers and printing presses. Okay. Sometimes they are the same, but sometimes they are not. So these are the publishing houses, and so this is how we start date, end date. Some of them we don't have the end dates. Some of them we don't have the start dates. So the information can be salty. Bless you. But as long as we have the address, historic address, and this is greatly benefited by the street directories that Calcutta has in the 19th and early 20th century. It's an invaluable source of information. So that's the publishing houses. Then the printing presses. We followed basically a similar logic, a locational ID, and following basically my Durga Puja model, except that P4 here refers to printing presses. Okay. So these are I'm just showing you the top part. So it's a very long list. In other words, the database is extremely, like at this point, unmanageable. And then bookshops, very living part of the city. Many of these have lasted since the 19th century. Many of them have gone out of business. And we did, when I made a decision to stop at 1945, because that's what I have information on. So I'm using 1963 directory because they have the information of the history, when they were founded and so on and so forth. And then the journals and magazines, and you can imagine between all the languages that we have journals of that we're talking about those published from Calcutta. They are in English, Bengali, Hindi, Oriya, all kinds of other languages, Urdu. It's an exhaustive task. And this part is actually, despite being the longest list, it's still not complete. It will take some time to have this completed. And educational institutions, this is in some ways easier because many of those institutions are in some way still existing. And it's not difficult to find, this kind of data is not, it's easy to locate and find. And other institutions which are not under the sort of the head of educational institutions, like Agriculture and Horticulture Society of India, were very important for, they produced their own volumes and so on and so forth. They were extremely influential in the sort of the literary realm. And just so you know, when by literary we mean we're very capacious. We include humanities, science, and all knowledge production, basically. And then people. This is probably the most incomplete because you start with the most obvious and then you recognize there are so many more. One of the reasons I got interested in the project, and I'll come to that in a bit, is that I was interested in how did people know each other? Where did they meet? Where did they converse? Okay, there's a long history, and it's sort of partly self-propagated by Bengalis that there were these famous addas, conversation, space of conversation. But I am actually interested in where did they take place. It should not surprise you; it's very gendered. Okay, but that also is of interest. Where did they meet? Did they meet in each other's houses? Did they meet in an educational institution? Did they meet in cafes and coffee houses, or things like that? So the maps that following that logic, we started to, and I did a sample part of it. So this is with incomplete data, and you can imagine this will get really populated. Okay, and then I want to parse some of the relations. The way I'm thinking about it, there are sort of three parts to this, if I remember correctly. Why did Calcutta become so important as a place of literary work in every capacity, knowledge production? Some of the easy answers are that, well, it was the center of the empire in the subcontinent. Educational institutions were established by colonial authorities, but far more institutions were established by Indians. And that also is registered in the literature that there is. But there's actually a lot of things about knowledge production, how collection of books started happening, how we actually think about both how people collect, the gathering of books, archives happening, and how they are disseminated, how they are, they move about, how discourse happens really. And I borrow a term, prokino, that means scattering literally, and I borrow it from one of Gautam Bhadra, historian Gautam Bhadra's work, where he's talking about Munshi Abdul Karim, and talking about his Puthi collection of manuscripts. What is that sound? So the collection of manuscripts, and he uses the term with a very different intent. For me, it's actually very suggestive. Prakina is based on a Sanskrit word. Actually, at one level means scattering, but also means like they're ember-like. From that scattering, something else gets productive. That's something that Bhadra had invoked in his work. I found that very suggestive. So, you can think of, extension, expansion, refraction, and how one thing leads to another, how things come together. And one of my arguments in terms of understanding collections of books and other artifacts and their dissemination is that they always begin with a scattering, and sometimes a violent scattering. In other words, violent dispersal, before they gather momentum for other things. And this is where my original interest comes from of this project. When I was working on my last book, one of the things that I included was about bookshelves. Bookshelf is one of the artifacts that I'm looking at. And that idea comes from having encountered something quite extraordinary. I'm a big, it's not an inappropriate term, but fan of Ishwar Chandra Vidyashankar, the educationist, social reformer, writer, and shaper of modern Bengali. He's known for, do you know what he's known for? What is Ishwar Chandra Vidyashankar known for? Yeah.
Widow Marriage Act of 1866.
Very good. So that's the social reform is very, very important. But he was, he was an educator first before he was anything else. He was Sanskrit Pandit. But he was also extraordinarily adept in writing English. He learned it himself. He wasn't taught it. He learned it from friends, actually. And he had an extraordinary book collection. And his, I'm happy to answer that, but his book collection ultimately ended up in the Bongya Sahitya Parishad library, which they still are there, so you can actually see Ishwar Chandra Vidyashankar's bookshelves. He actually built a house around it. Hopefully I'll put in the slides so we can talk about it. He actually built a house to house his bookshelves, which were custom made. He ordered his books from London, English books from London. They came and they were bound in uniform manner. And it's an astounding collection of books, most of which were in English, mind you, okay? Because Bengali books were not, even if he was a publisher himself, okay? But they're very limited in terms of its total number. Yes?
I am from the college or university he had established. So there are thousands of these just left routine. It's completely destroyed. There's a library dedicated to him. And he's used themes. Many book safes completely destroyed. So I wish him sometime you could see.
Yeah, I mean, Bongya Sahitya Parishad library actually has quite a few of them.
College.
Sanskrit Collins, right? Yeah. So he built a book collection to really sequester himself from the tumult of society. But society didn't leave him. They kind of intruded into his space, if you will. Because he was so well known. I mean, that's, people wanted to meet him, And the residence he built has actually survived extraordinarily. So there are some artifacts, including not just the bookshelf, but his some of the other furniture that belonged to his house. He has an extraordinary puthi collection, manuscript collection as well, and they were in multiple languages. But the idea of a good shelf, what is a good collection? So Babington Macaulay infamously said, a single shelf of good European libraries worth the whole of the native literature of India and Arabia. I was making a polemical point, and nevertheless, I think it struck a note amongst many for both sides of the debate, if you will. So what is a good shelf? What constitutes a good shelf? A good shelf of book. So that actually, that both as a suggestion and as a kind of a metaphor of civilized living that attracted me. Like, what is it? What should a good shelf have, really? So a good shelf is clearly a synecdoche of empire. In other words, this is what Britain would give to, India is a good shelf, the civilizational impetus of colonialism. But it also means good judgment, good taste, order, and capable governance. So all of it is encapsulated within that, because that's the context in which he was speaking. It was about giving in law giving, that's what he was thinking about. It was about education, it was law giving, because he was a jurist after all. So there are, when I put together my argument for small spaces, and it's called a good shelf, there's a particular material culture of collecting and reading in colonial India. And bibliomigrants here, term I borrow from a different author, enabled movement of books, collections, literatures from Europe to India to Europe. And in other words, there was a certain kind of dissemination of knowledge that happened. Books, bound books like that, rather than puthi, was a new artifact in the 19th century. And one of the things that interested me is how did it become so normalized in ordinary household? The horizontal bookshelf, what you see here. Since when did this populate our households? Okay, our middle class households? Well, in fact, it's very recent. Okay, but in this depiction in 1813 by Charles Dolly, English gentleman is Munshi, he's trying to learn the Arabic script, and he's exhausted from it because the colonial government, EIC at that point, wanted colonial officers to have an understanding of Indian languages before it was just given up as a desideratum. And here, this person clearly is in charge. Okay. Now, this relation would be significantly reversed in a few decades. But here, what is useful to know, and what looks like a lampshade, there's actually the dictionary of Hindustani. That's the one of the major books. But look at these. They're uniformly bound, and that's books in those days. You had to take loose leaves and have them bound at the binder. That's why bookshops and binding shops were often located in any city very close to each other, including Calcutta. So, I wanted to think about bookshelf as a literal and metaphorical role of mediating all kinds of power within the administration, power amongst social elites and middle classes and emergent bourgeoisie. By the time Macaulay was writing his professing this idea about what is a good shelf, a significant number of Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit workers already enlarged private libraries in Europe, in various parts of Europe. There were also becoming part of archival holdings in first the East India Company, and then much of what we go and study today at the British Library comes from that sort of lineage of collection. And it had a very particular beginning, and that was the end of the Fourth Mysore War, when Tipu Sultan was killed and his library, in the true old good fashioned way, was ransacked, looted, collected, part of it sent to Fort William College here in Calcutta, and the rest were all of it was supposed to be sent back to London to the East India House. But some of it was, then ultimately copies were left, and this was Lord Wellesley's doing. He basically started the war without the Board of Governors' permission, so it was, let's say, an illegal war to begin with. But so it had to be justified by its success. And one of the success was looting of the palace, between the jewelry and the manuscripts and everything in the palace. And the palace was ultimately, in a few years, destroyed. So his collection of 2,000 manuscripts were moved as a major sort of sign of power and conquest. And what is interesting is that his library, his archive, it's it's a state archive and a library, the combination of two, was described as a dark vault-like space and a warehouse. Now there's no perceptible order. The thing is that manuscripts were kept very differently than they were in the Bodleian, and there was a direct comparison made with the Bodleian library, how books were kept in shelves there. Books were chained actually, so people didn't walk away with them. But because they were the big, heavy, tomes, and they were, one of a kind, and you cannot, replication was not that easy, duplication was not that easy. But they were not arrayed like that, because manuscripts were actually kept in cloth or leather and protected and kept in chests. Whether it is in temples, whether it's in mosques, whether it's in princely collections like this, they were kept primarily in chests. Okay, that's how they were kept. Now, Tipu's library had a particular life. So when they arrived in London, a new space was set up to a library, and not just for the books, but also for other artifacts that were collected. And this is what the design of that was. So you can see these shelves as those that was called. This is called an exploded elevation. So these are the elevations of these walls. Elevation is a orthogonal projection of what this surface would look like if you saw it perfectly orthogonal. Okay. So, and this was the Oriental repository was displayed in a shelf we could describe as decorated in gold and azure. Very, very different from supposedly how Tipu's library was kept, because Tipu's library was seen as a symbol of his despotism, the de-Oriental despotism, and this one was all about enlightenment, and this is of course corporate loot. Then in the mid-19th century, in 1868, and historians like Gautam Patro have written about it, and others, have written about it. The part that I found very interesting is that the description of how the collections were actually kept, where they were kept, how they were organized. And there was a prevailing notion that the study of Sanskrit, for example, will not happen in India anymore. It will happen in Europe. In other words, deadening live languages was very important. Whether it is, Arabic, nobody paid attention to Urdu, but Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit, because they were also seen as having actually tremendous sway over the population. In other words, there was an understanding that this has political import. So deadening of the languages was very important. So part of this collecting of manuscripts in 1868 became a kind of a India-wide endeavor. So with the goal that, and there was a heavy emphasis, it was not so much on Persian, or Arabic, it was really on Sanskrit, to moving Sanskrit manuscripts from India to collections in Europe. And what they did to make it useful for that, those who were collecting, and they were supposed to deposit the manuscripts to, so think of it as a divisional head, and they were entered within sort of a taxonomic system, in a list basically, which interestingly got rid of everything particular, effective that manuscripts might have meant to the collector. And this was a hard game to win because people did not want to part with their manuscripts for love of money or a threat of life. The people really valued their manuscript collections. So it's a very interesting, it's a very easily available document, very interesting to read the experience of the lead collectors and what they how they report, including Rajanlal Mitra, whose reports are actually very, very useful. So the way I think about the aura of each work was reduced to a shared readership, and it facilitates the work of putting a collection within a recognizable European aura. It was meant to be useful to Europeans. But what I call the material culture of reading, this is where it's not just the books, but where you read, where you keep books, how you handle books, how you take a book or a manuscript is read very differently than a book. Manuscripts you have to open up like this, or use single leaves, one after another. Different manuscripts come in different forms. So the materiality is tied to social relations and how social relations are organized around the act of reading. And it was very, very well recognized both by the colonial collectors and by the Indian collectors that many of the manuscripts had a performative oral aspect. They only worked as performance. So you kind of, they were, think of it as storytelling. Okay, it was, some of the manuscripts could be quite notational, quite cryptic, and they were enlivened by the performance itself. And they were actually useful across classes, castes. They were collected by, and this is something that both Dinesh Sen and Abdul Karim, two of the more very important collectors of Bengali manuscripts in Bengal, noted that it was surprising to them how many manuscripts they found from what they considered low caste and let's call them subaltern households. People kept manuscripts even if they were not adept at reading them because they had extreme sacred value. What is also interesting is that the movement from manuscript to print, it was very important to these collectors, and this is where the nationalist collectors had shared something with the colonial collectors. They wanted this manuscript from individual collections, from temples, etc., all coming to central archives, without really attending to the fact that who would access them there. In their dispersed sort of geography, they were attended to. They were actually listened to. They were performed. They were revered. But once you put them in, let's say, a collection in Calcutta, they will not have access to that. That's for sure. So this is something that remained absolutely unaddressed in there. In like I said, both the colonialist and the nationalist collectors. In other words, those who were doing the collection because of a nationalist imperative. So the move to manuscript to print, which was ultimately to have these works printed, they also neglected the fact that if you're not used to print, you have to take yourself to the 19th century framework. If you're not used to reading print, if you're only used to reading manuscript, it is a formidably difficult task to make that move. They took it as natural, teleological, but it remained formidable for those who could not make that move. We can talk about that a little more later. But when the artifact of the public library came into existence in cities like Calcutta, and Calcutta in particular because that's my site of study, they took a particular form. they were, but this is, Metcalfe Hall became the Imperial Library before the Imperial Library moved elsewhere. And they were neoclassical buildings, so clearly representing colonial authority. And they had, if you look at the plan, however, they are, remember I showed you lots of plans of houses? They're actually no different from those. And this is, in other words, you go like, how is this particularly suitable for a library? Actually not. So they had to be configured to have collections, but also had other functions of meeting, gathering, and so on and so forth. Something to keep in mind. Now, I mention this because by the mid-19th century, in cities, major cities across the world, there's really a lot of thinking going around about how you should design a library, because these are libraries, not private libraries, which was the norm before that. These are libraries where you'll have ordinary citizens coming to read. So how should you configure the space? So architects at the time, really rethought what these buildings should look like as specifically for the function of libraries and a public library. So some of the wonderful details in this building, this is the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, is that, look at this opening. There's an opening here, so light comes from the top. These are the shelves, this is the figure. So you take the book from there and go to there to read. So you take the book from the surrounding bookshelves and take it to a central position to read. And to facilitate that, there are actually the top, the roof is skylit. So you have ample daylight. Okay. Again, task lighting is very important because this is days before electricity. Either you have natural light or you have gas light. There's nothing else to light up these spaces. So there is actually work being done in other parts of the world thinking about what a public library should really look like. What are the functions of a public library? How do you keep, as we say, stacks separate from reading material and readers? Where would the staff sit? So all of this discussion is going on. We don't see that. Public libraries would flourish in Calcutta, and not the ones that were established by colonial authorities, but those that were established by locals on the basis of neighborhoods. That's why the idea of neighborhood library. And sometimes folks coming together, not necessarily from the same neighborhood, but deciding we need a library for this locality for the common folks. And many of them started very small. Some of them started with literally, and I love it, one shelf of book. One shelf of, whether it's a good shelf or not, but that's a good shelf. If it's a beginning, it's a good shelf. And some of them, even the better known ones like this one, this is Bagbajar Reading Library, it moved several times. First in, somebody gave a room in their Waitakana to do this with a veranda so people could just meet. And these are really small spaces. And then they would go to another rented place, because they didn't have a permanent location, until they finally found a place and some funds to actually build a purpose-built library. And some of them, like Chaitanya Library here, these were visited by the, if you look at the patrons in the 19th century, is who's who of Calcutta, and particularly both the English and the Indian community. This library is actually in really bad shape, which is very sad. But they were sufficiently, they were able to manage a fund to actually build. This is like if it's a one-floor building or a two-floor building, a building on its own. What is interesting about Calcutta and public libraries is that the tremendous proliferation of public libraries. So this data, this graph gives you a sense of how the numbers went up. And I'm not even talking about the provincial ones, okay? They are happening at about the same time. And as you can see, something happened between 1905. What is 1905? Why is 1905 important for Bengal?
So this is
Yeah, it's a partition of Bengal, right? So you can actually map these along political events. So every political event created a momentum for more gathering, more libraries, something that the educational, the political was clearly, or let me put it this way, community building became very important. And by 1925, this huge spike in 1925, and by the time things became more organized, there were small funds available, and there were very, very, petty funds were available to support these endeavors. And libraries were, it was very well known, they were locations for all kinds of meeting, not just educational, they were, very important places for political meetings. Political gatherings, because so many places were, political gatherings were basically prohibited. So libraries, clubhouses, including bar library, mind you, and tea shops became spaces of political gathering. The good thing about libraries was that they were usually within an enclosed premise, and they were usually within residential property. So there is a barrier for, they're really not public in that sense, in that funny space between public and domestic. So there's a, and some of the earliest ones, the 1872 Calgary reading rooms, and before that, actually, I should mention, and I have a different piece I wrote about it, is the, Chandanagar Library, which was founded in the late 1960s by a zamindar who took it upon himself to build to construct a purpose-built library. He could afford it. It was a political move, but it was also a library which had meeting rooms and also where guests could stay and work. In other words, think of where we can, he had guest facilities. It is important for those of you who know who William Wilson Hunter is. He stayed there and worked in the Jaykrishna Library for several weeks or months. So in other words, there were meeting rooms, there was library collections, there were reading rooms, and also, and it was clearly meant as also quasi-town hall. So these libraries functioned in all kinds of ways, and that's a very large building. Most of these were very small interventions. And to the effect that when we look at, compare that with, say, London and New York, two cities which had an extraordinarily endowed with libraries. Okay. In the case of New York, there are borough libraries which are very well endowed. This was a commitment from the part of the state and the federal government, but also private corporations like the Carnegie Corporation, big involvement in library, big charitable concern. But when you look at that and you go, well, look at the area square miles. Calcutta is really tiny compared, percentage-wise. So if I do per capita, Calcutta had more libraries than London or New York. That requires an explanation. How is it possible? So this is something that got me to thinking when I was working on that for my last book, that this requires, this literary milieu requires some explanation, and how connections were forged between not just the libraries where the gathering of books is happening, but also gathering of people, but also the allied institutions that supported them, including publishing, printing, bookshops, educational institutions. And in this project, it's something I didn't pay attention to in small spaces, where I was really looking at Vidyasagar's library and what it meant. I was looking at Tipu's library and then Vidyasagar's library, what it meant as spaces, these new spaces. This library was completely invented. He kind of figured out how he wanted it. He had 26 custom-made bookshelves. I'm talking about very tall bookcases, basically. And that is, let me say, 26 of the ones that survived. These libraries, this is one of the older ones, and started very boys' own reading rooms, started with like 3 or 4 literally boys, kids, and became an institution in itself. So no matter who started it, how small the beginnings were, there was clearly a community investment in these. Starting from literally, I'm talking endlessly about stories about starting with one shelf, borrowed books, everybody donates some books, and then things get more organized. This one actually, by the 1920s, and this is why you see the peak in 1925, is because a library movement was started within the Indian community. In other words, to populate spaces with libraries. This was very intentional. And some districts in Bengal were more successful in this than others, and Calcutta clearly had the lead. And I want to throw in this one because, you know, the Bokul Bagan Sarvajanik Puja I showed you? It's right next to this one. The point is that clubs, libraries have a very intimate connection. These are the nuclei of the localities of Calcutta. Until very recently, while Durga Puja continues, most neighborhood libraries are not doing that well. Okay? Some do, but most of them don't. And that itself is very interesting. As if, you know, libraries are at one time were definitely nuclei of neighborhoods. It's useful to think about which areas were populated. One of the things we can easily do by mapping, right, to understand the dispersal pattern. The part that I did, and because you wouldn't expect many libraries there, which is the area in this area here. So this is Fort William, this is the Maidan, this is the outer, you know, basically think of as, you know, Calcutta's outer ring road. Okay, this was the edge of the city of Calcutta. So this was, you know, wetlands, then industries. This was never ever either the most populous or the most well-off neighborhood ward at all. For this place to have so many libraries, in other words, within walking distance you have multiple libraries. Calcutta is a very walkable city actually. That tells you something, like something else is going on. In other words, just like Durga Puja, why are there so many Durga Pujas? I mean, come on, you surely don't need that many, right? So I started looking at this dynamics and had a very interesting conversation with the person who actually volunteers time. Most of these libraries, you know, there is somebody from the, like, because they're these institutes are government sponsored. In other words, there is some kind of government sponsorship. But let's say one librarian has been given duty for between 5 to 10 libraries, so barely is there. But it is locals who actually volunteer their time to make sure the library kind of runs in some capacity. But also, what I learned here is that you know, libraries like that, or this one, this is actually a Durga Puja that happens right here. This is the Kamala Library on Pamur Bazar Road. These are old institutions, and during critical moments in Calcutta's history, these libraries would be turned into also spaces for giving aid during the riots, during famines. So these places would become the community space, basically. So in other words, they worked more than as libraries, that's my point. They're not just about gathering of books, but they're really about gathering of people. And this one library, the Binayapur Library, was burned down during the 46 riots and was rebuilt. And when it was rebuilt, and the bookshelves were donated, and it actually carries family names. So there is, you see the particular investment of the locality, that family, like literally inscribed in the furnishing of the library. Binayapur Library is one of the very well-known neighborhood libraries of Calcutta. Okay? But what I realized by talking to the folks at Talibani Institute is that, you know, the library looks like a holy mess. Okay, the books are there, but it's nothing to write home about if you think. But it doesn't matter whether I think it's a good library or not. It works for them. Okay, and what I found, because this was still there was COVID had this was 21. They were using they had built a room on the terrace, and they were using it for tutorials for kids, and this is free tutorials. There's also optometrist that comes, there's a room dedicated to that. In other words, multiple civic functions are being locked into this space of the library to make it a flourishing space of community. And that is what I think connects the flourishing of libraries in the late 19th, early 20th century in Calcutta and now, is that irrespective of what they do, and including this one, for example, the Islamia Library in Shahbagan, they had a dedicated building, so they were extremely well endowed at one point. Now the library is not much to look at, but what was interesting is that, when I went there, the library was closed. So I asked her, when does the library open? Oh, it's open, just go and ask the shopkeeper there. So I walk over, it's a market area, okay? I walk over and I say, so do you? I said, yeah, what do you need? I said, I'm working on libraries, I want to take a. He just, dropped everything he was doing, came over, opened the door to show me. He didn't even bother to see whether anybody's watching over his shop, because nobody will do anything to his shop there, okay? So he showed me into the space, and look. I want you to look at the, look at all of this stuff and understand. If you are not tutored into the everyday use of space of marginal communities, you would think, what? This is a library? How does it even work? The person who showed me was very proud of the fact that there is a coaching center, there are computer training classes, and there are tailoring classes at the same time. And he also showed me with great pride the bookshelves. I don't know whether I have to. Yep. That's the interior. Okay, bookshelves and so on and so forth. And then I noticed written both in Urdu and Shelter for Urban Homeless. If it would not have been written in English unless there is a reason to demonstrate that kind of investment of community. It would have been written just it would not have been necessary. So libraries actually, present-day Calcutta, don't serve the functions perhaps it did once, but it does something very important and vital. In other words, those who have been able to utilize it for other community-oriented activities. And and this is also, and I want to end here, and then we can pick it up in discussion. If you think that the number of libraries sort of decreased after independence because the real momentum of nationalism is gone, it's not true. The numbers increased because the state supported it. Okay, and that was very important. So the numbers increased, all kinds increased, and when the population was about 2.9 million over 40 square miles, 340 were public and subscription libraries. It's an enormous number. And something to you to think about, why does this institution flourish? So, like I said, the part that of this project that is complete, as complete as a researcher can get, is the one on libraries. So, my goal is to do the similar thing with bookshops, printing presses, all the categories I showed earlier, to really understand what does a milieu in the real sense of the term, between settings and peoples and conversations and environment, how is that created, how is that sustained, and how we can understand it with an analysis, and yes, mapping. That's why the scape part, it's a landscape of the literary, and a literary in a very capacious sense. I'll stop there and then take questions. Yeah.
Ma'am, in the graph that shows the decadal growth rate of libraries in Calcutta, between 1934 and 44, there was a decline in the number of libraries. In particular, any specific reason for that?
My sense is that, and we looked at this carefully, is that, it reaches a saturation point, perhaps, that there is, if it was like this, I would have been concerned. Like then there's a sudden drop, right? But this is, and if you think about why are we not asking how much this rises, why are we so bothered about that? It's probably reached, you know,
It has stabilized basically.
it's basically, yeah. So, for example, one of the important things to look at, that the data is to look at, is that these are the ones that are established. Did they go, you know, did they stop